between First Nations and municipalities, primarily within Southern Ontario, but I hope that some case studies that I'll share from that translate over into contacts in terms of how to foster better Indigenous-led Arctic sovereignty. Would you like me to say some remarks?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Sure. How is this? Okay, great. So apologize for not joining you immediately at the start of today. I was at the Environmental Peace Building Conference hosted at the University of Ottawa throughout this week. Some of the conversations there situated around critical minerals, the interrelationship between that and conflict, but also looking at Indigenous conceptions of environmental peace building and what that looks like. And so rather than present prior slides, I wanted to share some of those conversations here with you as well. We heard Grand Chief Alatani from the Yukon speak to the need for new models of partnership versus paternalism and the establishment of more positive peace in the circumpolar north. We're seeing a shift from human security towards more national security, and yet the Chief's remarks reinstate the need to have more of a collective security approach that enables collective action and collective response. We also heard reference to sustaining landscapes, and this is very much something that was part of the conversations during the environmental peace building landscape conversations on shifting to a relationality. The way that sometimes translates into my work with Shared Path was we delivered a collaborative hub between Saugeen and Ojibwe Nation, upper and lower tier municipalities within their traditional territory. The reason that we did this was so that we could look at how to facilitate land use planning. There's a lot of downloading responsibilities right now, build more projects yesterday type of mentality, and we wanted to make sure that the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action were being implemented and respected. And so by bringing these parties together to look at how do you work and what is needed to ensure that that respect takes place, we discovered that planners in municipal departments needed to be able to speak to proponents by providing them with publicly available material. As a result of this collaborative hub, what we now have is a map of priority areas in the traditional territory, an outlining of what the process would look like for consultation, both for archaeological and for environmental reviews, as well as a guidance document on the duty to consult and accommodate and why it impacts municipalities. Because oftentimes municipalities will pass the buck and they'll say, no, this is federal jurisdiction. And yet when it comes to issues like, say, water, it's cross-jurisdictional, doesn't respect political boundaries. We're seeing that Bill C-37 is thankfully reintroduced this past week. This is the First Nations Clean Water Act. One of the reasons it wasn't previously introduced was because we had some pushback from jurisdictions at the provincial scale because source water protection was in there. Now, rather than looking at these interjurisdictional issues as risks, threats, delays on development, cumulative impacts as, again, delays in development, it's actually an opportunity. Because when you look at source water protection, you can bring multiple different parties to the table, you can get things done better. And it's important to start those relationships early and not do an after the brainstorming has already happened in terms of the project and you just need to now consult with the stakeholder. It doesn't work like that. It's earlier engagement. And again, back to that relationality that was talked to at the Environmental Peace Building Conference, moving towards more mutual care and reciprocity that's locally grounded in the expertise of those that have the direct relationship with the land. They're interested in sustaining those landscapes. They know how the landscapes work. If we were to look at how the military operates, sometimes there might be challenges when engaging in unfamiliar terrain, so it's necessary to have those relationships in place. But if there isn't prior doctrine that outlines how to engage, like we're seeing that there's going to be an increase in military activity related to environmental security, but is the military increasingly prepared? Is this doctrine allowed to engage with local actors and those that have local expertise in the area? So I'll just stop there for now.
Wonderful. Enjoyed your presentation and enjoyed this very much. You might be angry with me for, well, he doesn't get angry with me, so, but maybe a bit of a challenge to the Institute. There's a lot of rhetoric around Indigenous affairs in Canada right now. Consultation, we're going to talk, we're going to discuss, and all that. I want to talk about you at the government level, political level. I think we're on the verge of this coming apart. And if you haven't paid much attention to the Cowichan decision in British Columbia, it has to do with private property rights. This is being picked up by people in certain political persuasions to launch the biggest ever attack on Indigenous rights we've had in the last 50 years. right? And this is really, really serious. It's starting to spread across the country, very systematic, very organized sort of way. And it will undercut all the things that we're trying to do, because people are saying nastier things about Indigenous rights and Indigenous aspirations than I've heard in my entire adult life. And I started off, in the 1970s. It was pretty bad back then. Second point would be that the other part of what we have in Canada is that Canada is really, really good about making promises and really bad about delivering. And this is where the Institute comes in. We talk about Indigenous-led, questions about sovereignty. I don't know criticism of Norma. I'm sure. I hope she's well. But I hope you listen to what the Grand Chief was saying. Aboriginal folks are so gentle often the way they sort of talk about things. They were basically saying, you got the wrong agenda here. You're talking about Russia and China and diplomatic this and diplomatic that. He said, we've got, and Andrew mentioned this really quickly in this conversation. I think he mentioned the word fentanyl 3 times. I'm not sure if you realize that is the #1 security issue in Indigenous communities in Canada. All this other stuff is all fine and Jim dandy, but Russia's not coming, China's a minor irritant, Japan's not invading, none of these things. What matters is fentanyl, which is killing people at a ferocious pace. And what's really interesting is that we've now picked up an agenda that we refuse to talk about this. The current Arctic security agenda in Canada was driven by a man named Donald J. Trump. Do you really think we'd be actually having all these conversations and spending billions of dollars on Arctic sovereignty projects and defense initiatives if Donald Trump hadn't sort of had a hissy fit and said, do your 2% and we're not going to talk to you anymore? It was not very impressive from Canada's point of view. Our defense people have been talking about this for generations. They know we're underfunded in the Arctic. We are the least defended part of the Canadian or the circumpolar world. We've had lots of time to do this kind of background work and preparation. Now we're racing ahead with all these fast-track projects that will redefine Indigenous communities and regions and local ecosystems for generations. We made mistakes like this in the Second World War. We've done it again, do it again in the Cold War. We left all sorts of PCB dumps all over the Arctic because we had to respond to the needs of the 1950s and the Russian threats. So the interesting thing, when you get such a wonderful description of what we could do and the things that what approaches we could take, and then you have to ask the question, are we actually going that way? And are we listening to what the Indigenous folks have said? How do you feel? I'm not offering the words of the Grand Chief, but I'm sort of kind of trying to channel her a little bit and see if I can figure what she said. The government of Canada is talking about spending $30 or $40 billion in Arctic defense. Most of that money will be spent in southern Canada. Most of the military personnel will be based in southern Canada. They won't be based up north. They're not creating new economies. You're not creating this sort of new ecosystems or even very much infrastructure, to be honest. Imagine if Prime Minister Carney had said, we're going to make a better number, $50 or $60 billion, and we're going to bring every Indigenous community in this country up to the national standard in water, in internet access, in housing, in education, and healthcare. And a lot of Indigenous communities, and the remote ones in particular, the fly-in and fly-out communities, this conversation about Arctic security is just air. What they've had a problem with, they've had 60, 70, 80% turnover rates in the schools among the teachers. I don't know if you know this from before, but if you have extreme poverty, causes enormous difficulty in education. If you're very, very poor, you cannot progress economically, educationally, right? Teacher turnover has the same impact as extreme poverty. So in northern communities, you have extreme poverty and you have massive rates of teacher turnover. And we're talking about a knowledge economy and getting people prepared and skilled in trades and all this kind of stuff. It's simply not even close to being realized. So what we're doing is we're going to take a whole bunch of major projects, some of which are military, some of which is just added the name security onto a project that's been around for 20 years. That made the government want to fund it. It was the Arctic Grace Port security thing, which I've liked for a long time, but it's not a security project in any particular sense. We're just going to lay a lot on top of the Indigenous communities. We're going to build it too fast, not enough consultation. We're not planning it with them, not helping them. The reason I like the Grace Port one is it's an Indigenous-driven sort of project. They identified the route for the way they want to go. And we're going to be sitting here 10 years from now going, wonder why we got that wrong. Why did we get it so wrong? And I think it's partly because we don't listen to people like yourself, and we don't listen to the other really great ideas that are coming out here, because quite frankly, we don't care enough. I'm sorry to be really harsh about it, but I live in Whitehorse part of the year. My son lives up there. I work with the indigenous communities in the community all the time. CRRIC, you know where CRRIC is. CRRIC is 60 miles south of Whitehorse, right? CRRIC had the last 2 fluent speakers of their language die within the last 8 months. And we in Southern Canada don't even contemplate what that actually represents. These are languages that have been around for thousands of years. And the languages embed all the ecological knowledge, the water and the land and all this kind of stuff. So now they are in the year 2026. How do we rebuild that knowledge that we've already lost?
And I did send it to you.
And it all was there until a couple of months ago. So I guess the challenge here for the Institute is saying, okay, this is all a great conversation. Yes, Indigenous consultation is a really good idea, but are we actually going to do it? I don't think so. Go back to the very first presentation about perceptions of the Arctic, right? Canada is an incredibly southern nation. Well over half of Canada's population lives south of Portland, Oregon. You know, or is it Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington? I'm not sure which one it is, but we're way south of the 49th parallel, right? We're a southern nation. We're a bunch of urban people who are terrified of the Arctic, who would much rather go to Florida or go to Costa Rica than ever take a holiday trip up to Nunavut or the Northwest Territories. We are a disconnected country, nothing like Scandinavia at all, not even like Russia. So that's my pitch to you. Let's move a little bit beyond the feelings, the words that make us feel good. Consultation and collaboration and cooperation. These are all fabulous things. We have to do them, right? But let's really show that we listen to what the Grand Chief had to say. That in fact, security is something that's about whether they eat, whether they have proper housing. They need, what's the number in Nunavut? It needs 3,500 new houses to get up to really basic fundamental levels. That should be our national security agenda. That should be our nation's priority. That should be what we should be focusing our energies on. If we did that, we would be much more confident. We would integrate the North in a way that the North wants to be integrated into Canadian society. We have a foundation for economic growth over a long period of time. We make a difference.
I think that's a really beautiful way of articulating why national security is community well-being. And to the presentations that we also heard earlier in the day about the importance of if there's going to be foreign interference that points to divisions in society, are we caring for our people? Then we need to actually put our money where our mouth is. And I think there is in the Force to Nature strategy a financial commitment to the increasing the Guardians program, which is necessary. There's also been funding that was committed with the introduction of Bill C-37, the First Nations Water Act. But it's really important as you identify where is that money being spent. Is it being spent on people in the national capital area, or is it actually being spent on other parts of the country? And as our national security is also being threatened, and there's a sense of, I come from a place of balkanized. I don't want to see my family balkanized. I think it's important to actually look, okay, like, are we actually supporting different regions? Like Alberta lost like all their funding for their Council for Multi-Stakeholder Dialogue when it comes to water. So ensuring that like we are actually actively spreading the money and putting it to places where it could be implemented by people that have a local expertise and taking that subsidiary approach. Ultimately, we are a very vibrant country, but like how do we do that in a way that's still unified? But to go back to the perspectives that we heard, including last time, we had a really great breakout in Winnipeg, and we were talking about what does it look like to have more land-based work and respect and reciprocity. I can say that as a Southerner that went to Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories as part of my role with Arlen Waters, I went to discuss their water strategy. And this was a meeting that took place in Yellowknife. Again, fairly south compared to the rest of the Northwest Territories. And people were brought in from more rural and remote communities. And a lot of what they were saying is that they would actually like to be able to meet more often for the water partners in that territory, to be able to connect with those that are based in Yellowknife, and for there to be a sharing of information that is not just one way in terms of what is happening with climate change and that technology, but also bringing out those experts onto the landscape and learning from traditional ways of knowing and having a two-way exchange and having that be respected. Because at the end of the day, we need to have a reimagining of relationships where people are respected on their own terms and both things are also respected too, and that is brought into how we co-govern.
Well, could not agree more. And if you haven't paid attention to the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area Strategy, which is absolutely brilliant, Guardians program has incredibly successful. Going to communities where they've set up guardianship programs, and you have all these young people who are working and earning a salary, out working on the land, working with understanding the animals, talking to the elders. This stuff actually really works, right? And it doesn't sound like security. But actually it is. It makes the community more secure, it makes the environment more secure, it makes Canada more secure and a much more successful sort of country. And instead, what I actually see us doing is responding to Donald Trump on the one hand. And sure, we know there's a real danger in doing that. And the other one is we're just looking for a chance to get rich. Build a whole bunch of big projects going as fast as we possibly can. That's such an old style approach in Canada.
Yes, although critical mineral and like resource extraction is a big part of our economy. And one of the things that was discussed at the Environmental Peace Building Conference is a way to de-risk some of those projects. Process is key. Building engagement is key. Building trust, ensuring the cumulative impacts are taken into account. Like, why is it that we have so many orphan wells in Alberta and that there isn't a policy that's actually intergenerational, respects some of the principles based on the peoples that were here before all the rest of us, that knew how to live with the landscape and to sustain those landscapes, at least we integrated into how we develop.
I really agree. One of my favorite First Nation groups organizes the Chaltan in northwestern British Columbia, who I think have collaborations with 7 different mines. And they're really engaged in exactly the way you're talking about. They created a real kerfuffle the last little while because a mining company agreed to go ahead and invest whatever, $300 million. But they started off by investing something like $50 million in per capita distributions in the community. Because the community said, look, we're going to wait for 10 years for something back from all of this. We want a return. So you got tons more to say. I've already talked too much. Is it okay if we just ask for people's comments?
Please.
And do you want to say?
Well, I think that there's also some experts here in the room from Oceans North that might also have some really cool perspectives from the work that they do too.
Okay, that's me. Unless there's someone else who else my colleagues. I didn't want to interject too much. I really appreciate the other points that were made. Can I project? One to be right.
Is it being streamed?
The microphone is right here. This one right
We
here.
can share one here.
You need to leave the microphone at the table.
Thank you for that, Natalia. That's lovely of you to call me up. And I really appreciate the comments being made. I think it's very interesting to be in a room that sort of labeled a conversation around Indigenous land, Arctic sovereignty. I would say earlier in the day we heard about issues related to international management of the Arctic Ocean. There are a few bodies like the IMO and the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement that have Indigenous people as permanent observers at those bodies and participants on their delegations. I think that's a really, really interesting model, as like anything that goes on in like high seas areas does not strictly stay in high seas areas. We know that the ocean is an interconnected system. And so talking about the transpolar route without talking about coastal Indigenous communities is just a little plug for that, because we didn't take questions after that presentation. In terms of here at home in Canada, I feel really badly being the person to plug this, but I will just say that Inuit CRRIC last summer came out with a set of recommendations for an Inuit vision of Arctic sovereignty, security, and defense. And to hear President Obed of that body talk about it, it's very similar to what you were saying, Dr. Coates, which is that actually the Canadian Arctic is a peopled place. We refer to it as though it's this sort of vast, expansive territory, and of course it's more sparsely populated than southern Canada. But the fact that it's a peopled place is actually what is like instrumental to our claim of sovereignty or security in that place. But it's only as good as what the people have in terms of their well-being. And so for 100+ years, we have neglected that part of our country, its infrastructure, the well-being of its people, food security for the people that live there. And if they're not there, then we are not going to achieve the goals that we have described today, right? That's not the sole reason to do that. I think we have a moral obligation to do that, but certainly it is I want to talk about multi-use activities, that's something. And then the other thing I will just say is that the Guardians programs are a really interesting example, because one of the things that comes up a lot when we talk about defense, sovereignty, and security in Canada's Arctic is the need for domain awareness, better and greater awareness of what's actually going on in Arctic waters. For example, I work on shipping primarily, so I'm less land-based. I'll leave that to other experts. But the notion that you could send a whole bunch of new personnel and pay for those personnel to be up there when that ocean is a working ocean. There are people out on their snow machines or out on their boats that could absolutely contribute to greater domain awareness and security in Canada, but could also be paid to conduct things that they're currently doing mostly on a volunteer basis, like local search and rescue operations or other incident response operations that take them out of their community and draw down on their capacity. Coast Guard Auxiliary is a voluntary position in many communities in the Arctic that could really use gear and resources. If we're going to spend money on militarization of our Arctic waters, why not give it to people and support their continued presence and existence in those spaces? So I will stop, but thank you very much for that.
We'd just like to echo that point and to say that there was a shared waters conference that Oceans North, Northern Confluence, and Ottawa River Keepers supported out on the Ottawa River not too long ago. And that was one of the key things that we also heard when people are trapping and hunting out on the land and they have that ongoing relationship with the land. Are they also then being funded to do some of the long-term environmental monitoring? And how can there be that dual purpose and that multi-purpose perspective to ensure that that type of work can be funded as part of our security strategy for the various reasons that we've heard? But then also, like, how can doctrine be directed to ensure that there's environmental purposes and including engagement with those local authorities?
Great thoughts and comments. Other people's observations and questions?
Yeah, I'm Joan Kuyak. I've got a long history with Mining Watch Canada and other mining activities. And I wanted to say that I also am with CRRIC Climate Action now. I think I wanted to say that I think a bigger threat to our sovereignty and our health as a country is probably the threats from climate change and from the leftovers of industrial development. The biggest threat in the Arctic, especially in the Western Arctic, is probably the threats to the Mackenzie River from the giant mine, which has 237,000 tons of arsenic dioxide stored underground on the shores of Great Slave Lake, and the oil sands, which are a danger also to that same river system. All these national projects of national interest are being pushed forward without environmental assessment and without the kind of oversight that the communities themselves provide. The communities along that river have been screaming for more attention to it and an end to the kind of projects that continue to threaten these systems. And they're a bigger threat to us in many ways than any kind of attack from outside would be, because the attacks from outside, as we know, end up in war. And war, as we've seen in Ukraine and Gaza, is destructive to everybody. Defense doesn't really help very much in these circumstances. I wanted to thank the panelists for those excellent presentations.
Thank you.
Just do a little bit of a response to that. I think there's multiple different forms of threats and the role of the military to anticipate and respond to the worst case scenario. And so what is a threat? Is it human-based, or is it also an existential threat due to biodiversity loss, pollution, climate change, and the impact that that has on our operations and our well-being? And so how are we also designing for that and preparing for that? And how are we not damaging our livelihoods in the long term? Like, ultimately, this might be a new country, but we all want to live here and we want our next generations to continue to live here onwards. So what are we doing to design our major projects in a way that is more accountable and transparent and fair? And with a lot of the downloading from the federal to the provincial for the impact assessments, how might that be an opportunity to, again, engage multiple actors, including Indigenous communities, and use the fact that C-37 is now being produced and that addresses source water protection, and that might be able to fill some gaps?
Just as one interesting example to reinforce that point, I've actually, a lot of my friends are involved with the LNG industry in British Columbia, which has very, very strong Aboriginal support. Not consistent. There's some very, very strong non-Aboriginal opposition, but it's kind of an interesting thing. And part of it comes back to what I was saying before, that when you ask them, why are you doing this? Sure, you want to protect the land, all that kind of stuff. They're actually really tired of being so poor. And, you know, there's no other alternatives. Nobody's come up with a new model, right? We had this fantasy of a green economy for, well, in the previous Trudeau government that never took hold anywhere. And we spent a lot of time thinking we're going in that direction. You need an economic base for the communities, because one of the things we have passed on to Indigenous folks is our commercial and material aspirations. You know, so they want the things that everybody else wants, and that's a really interesting challenge. Really interesting challenge.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and it's not provocative. It is simply the statement of the harsh truth. So what I found fascinating, especially when I was listening to Hattie, a colleague in the legal profession, speak about international law, is that throughout the entire morning, and in your conversation as well, we've had mention of a negative role that China, Russia, and U.S. Are inflicting on the whole world. And the ecology, I'm talking the humans, the ecology, and the entire future of humanity. Yet we didn't have one mention of criticism of the other veto power countries, the UK or France. And we had no reference at all to the United Nations or the international justice systems. We had even our global affairs speaker really speaking of what is obviously the government policy, the need to make Canada great, make Canada more economically powerful, to have them more clout in the international community, in the competitive, ruthless, abuse of power community where the rules of law internationally are diminishing every day. And not only diminishing, but being defied and ridiculed. So my question is, wouldn't it be wise if Canada, and it appears it is, if Canada is the only country in the world that has this unique and amazing evolutionary experiment with shared governance within a confederate one sovereign state, and vast amounts of territory are entrusted to the stewardship and leadership and example and the values of Indigenous people, and the ability of them to govern and accept those responsibilities are so inadequately funded. People are inadequately trained to take on these enormous capacities and responsibilities without a huge investment of the Canadian government. So what the Canadian government appears to be doing with OAS is bringing the communities together and working with them to come up with a united position. So my question is, what do you think about directing investment at an improved global rules and justice system that are effective and enforceable? And imagine what was said by our distinguished professor this morning from Bangladesh. And that was, let's imagine that kind of world where we actually can cooperate. How do we invest in that? We use the money better that way.
So there's 1,000 answers to that. There's a series of questions, and I'll give my first quick observations. We went down that path for a long time, and for very tragic reasons, we've gone away from it. The question is, how do we go back on that path again? I think the United Nations has lost a ton of its credibility. I think international institutions are suffering. I think countries like Russia and Iran and the United States are sort of going off in their own, badly off in their own directions. And how we get back into that again? You're in a bit of this with Carney, Prime Minister Carney sort of thinking, on the one hand, let's just go after Canada first. What's good for Canada is good for us. And the other part of him wants to say, okay, let's little powers, let's get together and lead a restructuring of the global order. We should be really scared for environmental reasons, for ecological reasons, for social reasons, economic reasons. We should be really, really scared with where the world is right now. I'm expecting my 8th grandchild in a little while, and the world is so much less safe than it was when my first grandchild was born 19 years ago, right? And we're not talking enough about the fact that we're creating all this global uncertainty, and there are peace builders all around this world. There are hundreds of thousands of people and organizations who live and breathe everything you're talking about. And the question, a couple of questions is, why have that group collectively lost the attention of government, but also lost the attention of the general public? You know, they aren't holding on to the public the way we think they should.
Thank you. Because collective security is collective action. We heard the need for the new model of partnerships. We heard that when there's a great power rivalry, there's a need for that multilateralism and multiple parties working together. When you have a sharp sword, you need the chainmail, and that's multiple different interlinked circles acting in defense. The environmental peace building community has been talking about that. The fact that we are underfunded, the fact that spaces like the Arctic Council or IASA, the International Institute for Systems Analysis, places where dialogue could continue, where track 2 diplomacy, where track 3 diplomacy could exist, it's not being valued because the thing is, oh, it's such a high risk time that we're in. It's highly securitized, so power gets concentrated, and yet you're then losing capacities that you have, because when there's a variety of threats, you need a variety of responses in order to be able to manage that. And like, how can you work with multiple actors, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, civil society, and then build that into our response?
Yes, so that's where you should spend the rest of the time. Not just here, but I think in the future, you think of where the Institute can go and the contribution it's making, you know, we've got real challenges. So we've been told we've been talking too much. That's pretty common in my case. So thank you very much for your interest and attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Coates and Natalia. This is a small announcement. Actually, we can't really move the mic in the panel discussions like in the front one, but we have set up the another mic in the audience. So I kindly ask you to use that one to raise your questions. Our next panel is on Arctic defense and security, US and Canada. Joining us are Dr. Matthew Landrio, Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed, Dr. River Piche, and Andrew Smith.
Very high-powered panel. Okay. You need a chair.
I sent it to
Do you
you.
want to go? Okay, then. So if you don't want to go, it's okay. It's okay.
I emailed you about it. আমার আগের প্রেজেন্টেশন মডিফাই করেছি।
Perfect.
I think the name has been brought better.
So where is the presentation?
In your email, I sent it to you at 12:19. This is Michael Landrios at 12.
So which one? This one.
We will start with Dr. Matthew Landrios'
Yes.
presentation.
Perfect.
Thank you. If you could hold
Yes.
slides, I'll just say next slide. What?
This one?
Yes, yes.
So, panel being on Canada-US Arctic and security and defense, I thought of pulling a few numbers. Graphs would be useful. Just to present what the perception of Canadians and Northerners are, well, Southerners and Northerners are about Arctic security. So the type of threats they perceive, but also the type of approaches that they would support. That work has been supported by the MINES program, the Department of National Defense, but also the government of Quebec through the Secrétariat aux Relations Canadiennes. Of course, your institution influenced the survey or had any questions to it. So the surveys were done in 2024 for Southerners, and in 2025 and 2026 for Northerners. One of the observation anyway that was reached this year, and I invite you not to take any pictures of the slides. The results, first time we present them, they're not really public for this year's version that was done in May. Okay, you good?
Yeah.
Okay. Previous slide. What is the previous slide? Yeah. So we saw a shift in perception in 2025 in regards to Arctic security and the type of threats that people were perceiving. So next slide, please. So just to a bit present the type of surveys we did with Southerners in 2024 and Northerners in 2025 and 2026. So next slide. Overall, we asked respondents, what is the main threat you see to the Canadian Arctic? As you can tell, in 2024, most Southerners would say Russia. About 15% or so would say the US. The US was a distant second. Of course, we saw a complete shift after the arrival of Trump 2.0, where the nature of the threat completely changed. So in 2025 with Northerners, we saw most people picking the US as the number one threat, close second being Russia, so a complete flip in the nature of the threat that remained, well, that only accentuated, that's the non-public survey results in 2026. The US is now solidly first as the number one threat as perceived by Northerners, a representative sample of Northerners. As you can tell, the Chinese threat is constant or is very close to being constant or just being in third place. It highlights in my mind two things: the case, and then I think it was presented in the morning, the case to Northerners to present China as a threat is harder to make than to present Russia as a threat or the US as a threat, right? It's just a harder case to make. It's not impossible, and it was presented in the morning, but it's a bit of a harder task. Of course, the US went to number one. I would say it could change. I mean, it's something that's really punctual with Trump 2.0. Democrats get elected in 2028, probably changes, maybe not completely, but we would see a pretty radical shift in these numbers. So it's not like it's in my mind permanent, but it could change very easily. Next slide. The other thing that we asked only this year in 2026 Northerners was about the type of attack that they deem to be safe against. So do you feel, now I only put the number for slightly safe or not safe at all, meaning percentage that of a type of attack that Northerners feel that they are not being very well protected against. As you can tell, air attack is number one, maritime and land, they're pretty far behind. The number one type of attack or threat seems to be a air attack. And you can have your own observation about the US is the number one threat, but at the same time, we're done with NORAD. At the same time, we think that a air attack is more likely or, than a maritime or land. Next slide. Yeah, so that one I think is pretty revealing on the type of approach. And that was one that was asked in 2010 by the Gordon Foundation in 2015 with Northerners, numbers for Northerners. We asked the exact same question with the same wording in 2025 and 2026 to see evolution. I think, the numbers are pretty striking, especially the first line. So Canada should hold a firm line to defend its part of the Arctic. So if we say Northerners don't want us to adopt a firm line, empirical data suggests otherwise. They want us to adopt a firm line. It's not just Southerners also in 2024, but that's another question. But it seems to them as a credible threat. And then it completely shifted from, it's better to negotiate compromise, which is, compromise, let's negotiate, let's talk, let's find a solution, to the more firm line, let's defend our part of the Arctic. The shift is clearly in the pursue a firm line. By the way, in 2025, we also asked Northerners, do you support a hike in defense spending? Most Northerners say yes. They are on board with it. I mean, based on the data we collected, there is pretty strong support for more defense spending, both with non-Indigenous respondents and Indigenous respondents. I mean, the level of support for Indigenous respondents is a bit lower, but still a plurality of Indigenous respondents saying, yeah, it's a pretty good policy. Maybe next slide. Does it change if you pick the US as number one threat, Russia as number one threat, or China as the number one threat? No. In all cases, you want Canada to pursue a firm line. Kind of seeing it there. It's on the 60% range that respondents that pick the US as the number one threat want us to hold a firm line. Pick China, same. Pick Russia, same thing. So it's pretty uniform. It's not like one is radically different than the other. In general, you see that across the spectrum of threat kind of assessed or perceived. Next slide. Just to conclude on what in my mind represent maybe the biggest threat, and this is in terms just of the Canada-US relationship. I think it would be pretty different. I would agree with what our bishop presented in the morning about environmental threats, about hybrid threats, definitely extremely salient threats to address. But just in terms of the US-Canada relationship and the Arctic, in my mind, the Greenland crisis that we went through in January struck the imagination in Europe for sure. We saw a distinct shift. But also, if you look at the Northerners and a bit the options that they would like the government of Canada to pick, if the US went expansionist on Greenland, let's say that was just, of course, an hypothetical scenario of the US attack Greenland, what do? I would, to be honest, support Greenland militarily as an option. Don't ask me what it would look like. I have no clue. But anyway, as you can tell, yes, the push for diplomatic solution is the number one option. But just add the first two bars on the left. They got about the same support than let's use diplomacy, which is often when you ask the Canadians, how do you want to resolve Iran? Diplomacy. How do you want to resolve this? Diplomacy. Diplomacy is the easiest choice of answer in a survey. People will always migrate, a strong number of people will migrate to this. But if you have the two on the left, support Greenland militarily and pass sanctions against the US, and again, don't ask me what it would look like, it's hypothetical, I have no clue what it would look like. It's about the same as diplomacy. So it's about the same number of people that will say, we need to adopt a firm stance, we need to stand up, we need, a robust approach than the diplomatic option, which is less robust. Next slide. Maybe the last point, I won't go off too much, but the issue of Greenland, in my mind, if you look at issues, threats in the Canada-US relationship involving the Arctic is the most problematic issue. If the US continue their expansionist thinking, if there is a Greenland crisis 2.0 and culminate into something where the US would invade or make aggressive threats towards Greenland, it could lead to a very unfavorable situation for Canada of encirclement, Greenland, Alaska, on either side of the Canadian Arctic. But even if you look at the negotiation between Greenland, Denmark, and the US right now, one of the main sticking points, if the US insists, is for 3 new military bases in Greenland, and that those 3 bases would be U.S. sovereign territory. Thinking from a Canadian perspective, like I hope Greenland and Denmark will hold the line and not accept, because in my mind, this would represent a dangerous precedent that if we look at the Kuzma negotiation and strategy of the U.S. of negotiating with the weaker party to impose a precedent on the slightly more powerful party, negotiate first with Mexico, make them accept something unacceptable, and then present it as a fact onto to Canada. This is dangerous in my mind, because if it's accepted for Greenland, I'm pretty sure the U.S. administration then will look at Canada and say, what about you? How about some military base in the Canadian Arctic? How about U.S. sovereign territory? And this, in my mind, is where it would not just be extremely costly politically, but it would be extremely problematic for Canada as a country.
I didn't prepare anything specific, but give to reaction or thoughts that I had. So when it comes to, I think the using, right?
Microphone close.
It's very hard to look at them as like a fashion factor. This is surely use of law. But it's important because a lot of what's happening right now around the White House, around Greenland, around the Golden Dome, is all about giving them away. And so it's more about how do you build a narrative where we don't lose face, where we don't lose public support, while also giving the President of the United States a sense that he's winning the negotiation. And so it's a lot of posturing, it's a lot of building narratives, it's a lot of being very careful about how things are portrayed, and then keeping most of the real conversation behind closed doors. And that's where it gets really difficult, I think. When it comes to,
please.
I think diplomacy is always interesting, which is that we are now in a world where we can't really go back. I think the previous panel described how the institutions have lost their credibility, and we have to realize also that most of the organizations that exist or that have, I would say, structure or world in the last 80 years or 50 years are no longer have the legitimacy that they had.
Alexander.
Either based on failure, if I'm thinking of the UN, in a previous life, I worked a lot on
Alex
education and the failure, moral failure of Minister and Haiti. But beyond that, the UN is not the UN without US backing, US guarantee, and that ability to bring everyone together. And so we have to agree that we have to realize that going forward, I do not think that the US is going to go back. I think the Democrats have also lost faith in the institutions. They do not see the old system as a system that serves the United States. And so going forward, I think we will continue to see tariffs to a certain degree. This is a good source of revenue for the United States. We will see them also kind of leaving the existing institutions for new formats that are going to be more advantageous to the United States and likely less advantageous to us. So we have to realize that we're in a world where we need to stand on our own 2 feet, but where it's also going to be more costly to do business and to do diplomacy and to maintain our national security, bigger defense, and so on. So and then last thing, the previous panel was super interesting, and I agree with everything I heard in terms of how security is perceived. What is security for local communities? And I think we're at a moment, there's a generational moment in Canada where we have a chance to do it right and to invest economically in the North in a way that actually supports Indigenous sovereignty and Northern, that's what I'm looking for, ownership and leadership at the local level. We have to do it right. I think there's a whole conversation around norms and values, but I think with that comes, hell is paved, the way to hell is paved with good intentions. I think a pragmatic approach to it the reality that we won't have a consensus. I think it's really hard. We're a very diverse country, also very fragmented. And getting everybody to agree is going to be very hard, but ultimately those conversations are important. But we'll also have to realize that we need progress and we need to make, So I don't have a solution. I hear you. Those are things that I've also taken into consideration in my own thinking, but I don't know if there's an ideal solution on how do we actually invest in the north in a way that there will always be winners and losers. Let's just make sure that it's not the same historical ones that lose and then win over and over again.
Thank you very much. Let me flag 4 things. The first point is Donald Trump is not an exception, believe it or not. This is the new normal. So the United States will have more of Trumps. It is bound to have more of Trumps. So Trump is not something out of the United States. He is part and parcel, a product of what has happened in the United States, particularly with this economy. There is, of course, the $38 trillion deficit, and that's not going to go away. So Trump, I believe, tried his level best to resolve that deficit. One was to make the government small, get out of WHO, get out of UN systems and all, and also the tariff. Hasn't worked much. So started going back to the old formula of engaging in wars. If you look at the number of wars the United States was involved in, it's unthinkable. But this one did not work with Iran. Iran was very ready. You go back to the national security strategy of Iran in 2005. In 2005, they wrote this national strategy and came to the conclusion that today or tomorrow, US and Israel will attack them in 2005. So what do we do? And they came to the conclusion that getting aeroplanes will not work because they will be dependent on other countries and the code may not come when the war will be there. So they don't want to be dependent on that. So what do you do? In 2005, they thought of missiles and drones. And then who would do that? Because, you need secrecy or intelligence of a high degree. So in 2005, they thought, invest in women. And today, they have the largest number of women scientists per capita in the world. Not to mention, Iran has the largest number of engineers per capita in the world. And that was done way back in 2005. So the strategy 25 years, now they were pretty ready with this missiles and drones. And so they don't need the nuclear weapons. They came to the conclusion. Not to mention Ayatollah Khamenei's, fatwa is there not to have nuclear weapons. They don't need it. They found a way out to defend because they don't want to win a war. There's difference between the two. So the first thing I would say, we need serious brainstorming that Trump is not going to go away, or Trumpism is not going to go away. And that's where the fuzziness between the Republicans and the Democrats. And whatever he is doing, go back to the leadership, the Heritage Foundation, this whole leadership agenda. The big one is 20 volumes, but the small one is around 1,000 pages, and you can get in the internet. Go through it, and you will see whatever Trump is doing is that, leadership agenda the Republicans have taught. And they had 350 scholars with 30 institutions. So it's a well thought out idea. So it's not going to go away. That's my first. So I think we need serious thinking of how to make the world a better place, because Trumpism is not going to go away. That's my first, the first thing that I want to flag. The second is the pessimism or the uncertainty that you see in some of the Western countries, you don't see that in some of the Asian countries. Kausar and myself, we traveled last month, 6 countries, and Kausar will tell you, he was telling me, look at the optimism. Serious optimism. And I was in Singapore, not to mention South Korea, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And a month before that, I was in China. So pessimism or uncertainty that you see is not a global phenomenon, believe it or not. There are millions of people who are excited about the world and are changing the world enormously in terms of technology, in terms of education, in terms of fashion, in terms of gastronomy. Amazing gastronomy have evolved. And look at the music that has come up. So you have to be very careful about the world. When we see that, the world rugby, when it's 2 or 3 countries, we said, come on, it can't be the world. The world is a huge place. Soccer can be a World Cup, I can understand, but not other games. Okay, so we have to be very careful of what we see. The uncertainty is not there everywhere. The third one that I want to flag is the US-Canada security rupture would not be that easy. Yes, I understand the Canadian Prime Minister has talked about it, but it's not going to be easy. It will be very difficult. After all, US is a big country and Canada is what? 40 million people. And then the linkage that you have, economic linkages, not to mention the civilizational linkages, it's not going to be easy. You need serious imagination. And that's the reason I said we need to go back to Ibn Arabi, or we need to go back to Einstein to think this imagination is more important. You need to imagine. It's not going to go away with the kind of education and the kind of discourse that we have. We need something, and I refer to it as a post-disciplinary discourse. We need to go beyond disciplines, because this is a new world, and the world has never seen a multipolar world. We are familiar with unipolar world, we're familiar with bipolar world, but on a global scale, we never saw a multipolar world. This is the first time humans will be witnessing an emerging multipolar world, and that requires a totally different kind of discourse altogether. And in my writings, I use the word post-disciplinary discourse rather than multidisciplinary discourse. With the multidisciplines, you have the disciplines entrenched. So you need to go beyond disciplines. My final point would be, and we can have a good discussion later on, but my final point, sorry. My final point is, when we talk about US-Canada Arctic security, we are still stuck with the statist understanding of security. We need to go beyond the statist understanding of security. It has to be post-statist. And this is where the indigenous community, their civilization can make a difference. Because they were never structured as a statist person. They were outside the state all the time. For some reasons, whatever. But they never got excited with the statist understanding, whether they live in Russia or whether they live in Canada, wherever they are. They had their own understanding, which is not the state, not the Westphalian state that we know. And this is where I think hope lies. It's only that we need to bring them in to see what is there, look into the roots, what was there, and then probably we can start imagining something different, and that probably will make difference to the Arctic security that we're referring to. I'll stop here.
So I managed UConn's international relations from 21 to 25. And a lot of that had to do with the US. So I'm going to zoom in onto a more regional way of talking about these relationships. which is unique within Canada and within the United States. I'll just remind folks that these are the thoughts of Andrew G. Smith, not the thoughts of the Yukon government, so stay clear on that. It's a matter of how much time I want to use up so that you can ask questions afterwards. But we'll go back to like pandemic years and I'll just do that quickly. And that was, it took a long time for the Yukon to make Ottawa realize that Canada has 2 land borders, not 1. And when we were allowing free transit of Americans to get, or when there was a question of Americans getting to America, like Point Roberts or the Northwest Angle, Alaska was completely off the radar. And we had to fight like hell with the folks from the U.S. consulate in Vancouver to try and draw attention to say, this is Americans going to America. They can transit, and we've got to put the safeguards in for them to do that. We give them the permits in order to do that within 48 hours, 72 hours, whatever limit we put on it. And we finally got there. But it was this like really stark realization that Canada doesn't realize that it has a second border to the US. Of which the vast majority of it is attached on the eastern side, the western side of Yukon. So anyway, because we have to solve those types of problems, border issues, health issues with the U.S., my relationships with the U.S. diplomatic corps became very strong. If I rewind back further in history and related to that transit of people, we're talking about the Alaska Highway, so built in a very short period of time, opened in 1942 in order to serve interests in the Northern Pacific and prevents any Japanese movements coming in to the Americas and the continent that way. And of course, that's a lasting piece of infrastructure that has had great impact, both positive and negative, to people of the Yukon and to people of Alaska. One of the issues that we work with the U.S. government and Alaska on as well is maintenance of that highway. So there's a chunk of that highway beyond Whitehorse, a city of 32,000 people, and then Haines Junction, a city of 1,400 people, and then 3 more communities along that highway, totaling probably less than 500 people. It doesn't make sense for the Yukon government to pave a road serving 500 people in the far extremes of its territory, but that is the service. That is the all-season overland service for Alaska. So they're the ones who say, well, yeah, you can't do that, but we need it. So there's partnership in order for that to happen. And we got there, again, with success. What is a funny story, or an interesting story, was that when, so this is about early 2024, the Alaska governor, I used to sit in on calls being the governor of the Premier, and the governor would just kind of sit there and ask questions, and we would kind of say our thing and wouldn't really hear anything back. So I felt like disinterest from the governor when he had conversations with Yukon. At one point, he decided he'd like to come visit Yukon, and we said, for sure, sir, we will accommodate you and we'll make that happen. So he comes to visit for the course of a day and a half, and we're kind of shocked that when he said, I've lived in Alaska for 35 years, I've never been to the Yukon. So he'd never taken that highway. It had always been air to a location in Alaska and then air to Seattle or Portland or Denver or wherever that flight would land at. And I imagine there's a lot of Alaskans that are like that, who just have stayed on the American side. So he'd never been and was very impressed, and he did a lot of learning. The governor Dunleavy's a teacher, and he is a very curious person. So I learned that on those calls, him asking questions was legitimately him wanting to know and wanting to explore and wanting to know people. And then we saw that demonstrated when he would just ask question after question after question out of complete curiosity. And he learned about our system, Westminster-based parliamentary. He couldn't fathom that you had an executive council that were also the ministers, because there's our commissioners, our cabinet is appointed, the U.S. federal government. So all of these different things, all this learning that happened back and forth. And one of the things that the governor was talking about at that time, in the Biden years, was the disconnect between Juneau and Washington, D.C. And then he couldn't get that kind of partnership, certainly not the same kind of partnership that he had with Trump in the first term. And so he was turning, kind of like Yukon was, to neighbors, because we're closer to each other than we are to our own cabinets. So how do we work together to do these things? So that laid a bedrock situation to build off of over the next coming years. And the guys went and did other things, and the relationships are managed by other people. What has happened in the intervening years, and I haven't read the readouts in detail because our premier was just in Anchorage, meeting with the governor, meeting with Alaskans. And it's manifold, the things that we're talking about. And there's things that are common that we have to solve problems for: energy, roads, fish and wildlife. And these are things that Alaskans are ready to talk about and are working together on. Indigenous-led healthcare, big in Alaska. And I think, try and get to a wrap-up point, but the Alaskan, there was a question earlier about how Alaskan natives, I'll use the American term, are incorporated into a certain set of thinking of the U.S. conversation we're having. And there's a similarity in the way Alaskan natives govern themselves and how Yukon conversations govern themselves. It's not exact, but it's treaty, it's legislation based. And then they have the right to form governments, and then there are these corporations that regionally govern different villages, so village corporations and then regional corporations. In Yukon, it's the First Nation government, the nation, and then the development corporation. And in both the Yukon and Alaska, those development corporations are amongst the largest corporations in those jurisdictions. Orders of magnitude between the largest Alaskan corporation, who's probably been helping get oil out of Prudhoe Bay for 50 years, and the largest Yukon corporation. It's just the business is the same, so the numbers are the same. So we've established those business connections and are encouraging those business connections for the cross-border trade and sharing of information and operating in similar geographies and similar cultures and similar resource sectors. And I think that's a very positive step, and it highlights a point from earlier that was, I think the person who said it was very careful. It said there are some states where Canada is their largest trading partner, not the United States and Canada's largest trading partner, which is true as well, but saying that the state level that are the ones who are going to be impacted by change. And who said she was in Maine and said that that economy. So I just bring that to zoom in sort of down past the noise of international relations, in that there are these strong connections between regions and across that border, and they will continue. And I'll just say on a couple other things that are a bit more rosy and sunshine, because I know I probably made folks a little bit upset how down I was earlier today, that the other things we look at are still in that soft diplomacy side. Arctic Winter Games hosted in Whitehorse this past year, hosted in Wasilla, just north of Anchorage, 2 years ago. And we had bets between the premier and the governor for who was going to win. And you get that mixing of Alaskan kids with Yukon kids with other folks from around the Arctic Winter Games community. And then the continuation of culture exchange, both in Indigenous cultures and in other cultures and other ways that we want to do that type of exchange. So I'd say that is still live. Is it as powerful as it used to be? I don't know. I wasn't there. But the point I'm trying to make is that you zoom in closer, there's a better idea of what the relationship actually is. And I wish Chris Sands was here. I'll make it my final point. Because Chris King spoke at Arctic Summit that CIS hosted. And one of the things that I had him there for was to tell that audience what he hears in Washington, D.C. about where the cooperation can still happen, but it's not being picked up and projected through big media and the big part of the story because it's not sensational. It's the boring bureaucratic stuff where we can still get the job done. And that was very nice for people to hear that there were still places that happen. And I think those smaller relationships are also those places.
Questions? Questions?
Any questions?
No? Okay, break. We'll go for a break.
My question, I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but again, Indonesia has 70 to 80 million indigenous people. The world has what, 500 to 600 million indigenous people. And isn't it time with the values of indigenous people to have Canada, by example, lead the emergence of indigenous people globally to become really the people that can help co-design a sustainable, coexisting without violence humanity, a relationship with the environment that makes sense and allows it to enable humans to flourish and build a world for future generations to survive and enjoy what we're not allowing them to enjoy if we continue on the path wrong. Is that not possible? Why can't Canada invest in that instead of joining the competition, which is a race to the bottom and the guaranteed extinction of the human race?
Very, very tough questions. I don't know who's going to answer.
Maybe answer quickly. The Arctic Framework was co-designed by Northerners and the Canadian government. Co-design means that you give and take. So you're not going to have your ideal version of the reality, but you need to compromise and go for a middle ground version, which is probably what happened in that document. We'll point out that many Canadians and observers thought it took too long to co-design. So I heard the criticism was, it takes too much time. So if you want to know, maybe one of the criticisms that we often hear when it's about co-production or co-design, that it takes too long. We don't have time to do this. Which I thought, co-produce and co-design is going to take longer. This makes sense. You need to go back and forth and, compromise takes time. And if you want to, it's going to take time. But I think one of the criticism was that compromising takes too much time. But I think the 2019 Arctic Framework policy was based on the idea of co-design. I think one of the criticism of maybe northern governments was that it was really demanding and time consuming as well. So they didn't have the capacity to answer all the requests that the Canadian government was throwing at them to do the co-design or the co-production. About the co-design bit.
I think it's possible. Nothing is impossible. You have to begin with that premise. Nothing is impossible. What is required is leadership, of course, and of course you need an alternative discourse to be and to invest in the alternative discourse. Take the example of Marshall Plan, for example. When George Marshall floated the idea at Harvard, or even when he started working 2 years before that, the war was still there in EU, and there were a lot of critics And I always make fun of that, that it was called Marshall Plan and not Truman Plan, because President Truman also did not want to take the risk of, putting his name, because no one knew that whether he's going to succeed on, this plan. The reason is that's the first time in history. It's the first time in history a victorious power decided to help a defeated power. That has never happened in history. And it was incredible at that particular time. And what you see in Europe today, particularly with the Germans and the French living together, if you come to Dhaka, they have an embassy under the same roof. Hitler would have committed suicide twice if you had seen that embassy. It's incredible. And it happened because humans can make a difference. Look at the destruction in Europe with the French and the Germans. The Napoleonic War, the First World War, the Second World War. And if I give you the numbers of people that were killed in Second World War, it's unthinkable. 66 million people in 6 years. Each year, 11 million people. The world is much safer now compared to that. Much safer. Okay, so I think humans can make a difference, but leadership is required. And here Canada can give leadership, but it will not come suddenly. And this is, I think, CRRIC and others, if they contribute to the alternative discourse, then the political leadership will take over. But if nothing is done, then the political leadership will not take over the thing. So I'm hopeful. I always see half glass full. Not to mention the other half is also full with air. So nothing is empty. So from that, I think we can make a difference. And this particular gathering shows that we can make a difference. Thank you.
You have a question?
Yes, I do. Thanks to the panel for the
Close.
thoughts. Okay, perfect. Sorry, my height. So my question is, I know that different regions in the Arctic have different impacts from the climate change or permafrost because of their internal or international policies. And as Professor Landry mentioned, if we see Arctic as a unitary region, it can prevent us from seeing the real risks and the threats as well. But at the same time, I'm thinking the world is moving more increasingly in a place where anything that happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects in the other parts of the world as well, and which invites perspectives or views from different participants beyond the states. So it's not only the states or Arctic states or non-Arctic states, but it could be private organizations or NGOs or ENGOs, social movements, and businesses, or it could also be, most importantly, lived experience of the indigenous peoples. So I'm thinking in this situation, as difficult or chaotic it sounds, there could actually be more hope, because now there are more participants at the decision-making table. So in this time as a youth, I'm just thinking from a solution-oriented mindset, how can we work collaboratively? What are some of our top 1 or 2 shared goals in the Arctic? And do we have the current tools and mechanisms or communication channels to kind of pursue those goals even during crisis? Thank you.
Wonderful question. Fantastic. Andrew.
Andrew G. Smith here. Okay, so Arctic states, I believe, must be the primary decision makers on Arctic states. So if and when India is allowed, or I don't know if it is already an observer to the Arctic Council, that observation is welcome, but that vote is probably not. I think and many countries have gotten to Arctic Council as with observer status for things like, but that primacy of the decision making has to be with that. Now, France a couple of years ago said or tried to create something different, and all of the Arctic states pushed back, and that didn't go through. So that seems to be holding. But we've got to maintain that, and as a Canadian, I think I say that with some conviction. Now, the partnership, it's a global world, it's a global economy, it's a global, group of people moving around the world. But that
primacy must remain.
I would say the structure of the Arctic Council does offer some of what you're describing. We also have to be careful to not idealize private sector or civil society actors. Everybody has different interests. We also have to be careful about not rewriting history. The Marshall Plan was about containment of the Soviet Union. It also led to the complete fragmentation of Germany. The rebuilding was there, but there was a clear strategic interest by the United States to establish its dominance in the face of the Soviet Union, and was part of the containment plan. So I think we have to be careful when we look at history and our relationships, and there's a lot of situation at a subnational level, and I think it's up to the Arctic state to deal with their population and their civil society to find solutions. And we also have, in a Canadian context at the very least, not the American, we heard Marisol this morning, but I can tell you the Canadian Armed Forces are very well aware of the effect of climate change and the importance of mitigating their footprint. And there's a whole organization within that's just looking at how to do that. And so it's worth looking at it, but I think we have to be pragmatic about the world we live in and be very careful of not being too putting rosy sunglasses when we look back.
One very quick point that we're a bit behind. Other actors are involved, but time is a limited resources. So, for example, when businesses wanted to have a bigger role at the Arctic Council, who was the actor that kind of raised their hand and said, "Well, I don't think it's a good idea"? Well, some permanent participants, indigenous organizations, you know what? They don't want to get their time being chewed by other actors. I mean, time is a limited resources as well. So, I think that Arctic states are involving you in some of their initiatives. I'm seeing the Norwegian are doing that, and I don't know if it's the Greenland's government or Denmark's at the chairmanship, but they are putting things in place, but it's often all channeled to the Arctic Council as that one forum. That's how they want to keep primacy over Arctic issues. Their interests, their power relationships.
Thank you very much. Big applause for the panel.
We will now take a short break. And please return promptly as we begin our final presentation of the day.
And I can promise a beautiful presentation by Dr. Alex Crawford and others. Hang on and don't go, just drink some more coffee. And I don't know, more steroids maybe. But hang on, these are brilliant presentations. And we have Professor Ahmad with us, Director of NRI, University of Manitoba. Thank you, folks. Have a break.
The hotel called my work phone. Whoever picked up my work phone was taking over for me in my position. She said one of the guests didn't show up at the hotel.
Yeah, Christopher Sands.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're
We asked in the morning. He didn't show up.
They didn't show up, yeah. So they're going to charge you the full amount. I'll try to call them and see if we can reverse that charge, but there's no promise at this point it didn't show up.
Sir, it's another adaptation.
I have to use my laptop. Should I stand up or sit down over there?
Oh, sit down, sir. আমি এখান থেকে দেখাবো স্লাইড, রাইট স্যার? আচ্ছা, ওকে। আর আপনার আগে আপনারটা কোনটা? এটা হ্যাঁ, রাইট। ওকে, হ্যাঁ, ফাইন।
আমি এটাকে যে ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড হিসেবে ইউজ করবো।
আচ্ছা, আমি এটা I'll put it up. আর
the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, right? And your country has signed it, ratified it, but isn't doing it, right? Have you implemented it in domestic law? Okay. So how do you? I mean, Canada. This is Canada's future. Right? All this is right. So this is why we have vast territories of land controlled by indigenous people who greater extent than ever before, right? And that's because we had all that space for very few people. Okay? And
Dr. Fabrice, can you hear me?
Manage 24 hours of darkness, 24 hours
Okay.
of sunshine. And
No,
controlled and,
but I need the
vast
microphone.
differences. Who wants to live up there and all that kind of stuff. It's not very common in most countries. So that's unique. Right? So, I mean, truly, what if indigenous people, no, I mean, if the governments like Indonesia's government and maybe governments, and the indigenous representatives in the Canada, indigenous government,
Dr. Fabrice, can you hear me? Dr. Alex Crawford, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Dr. Alex, Dr. Fabrice, can you put on the camera on kindly?
Yep.
Okay. Dr. Alex, I can see you. Dr. Fabrice, yes, fantastic. We both can see you. And Dr. Fabrice, do you want to go ahead first, followed by Dr. Alex? Okay. Fantastic. Dr. Fabrice, you do not have any PowerPoint, am I right? Exactly. So you're going to speak, and then Dr. Alex, I already made you co-host, so you can share your slides directly from there.
Okay, that sounds good.
Fantastic. Give us 5 minutes.
Make sure I can share here.
Yeah, let's try.
Yep. All right. I shared that, and then I go over to, it's on a random slide at the moment, but.
Yes.
All right. Cool.
Yes, all perfect.
Good, okay.
Excellent, and you can stop sharing, right? And doctors, just give us 5 minutes. People are just drinking coffee, and we'll be back again just in 5. Is it okay?
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Fabrice and Dr. Alex. Bye.
Thanks.
So that thing is still 5. Now we always catch specific between the
The most important government in every country in terms of understanding human needs. When indigenous governments have to become, there used to be local governments because they compartmentalized. So now we're asking them to move up and be like a provincial government.
Yes.
Right? And when they achieve at that level of self-government without becoming a province, right? Then they become international. Their only recourse is international, right? So they run to the United Nations because they get no help with their own.
Who I should send the airline invoice to?
airline invoice, you can send it to me, I can just forward it to the.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
And
you have my
Yeah, so a couple taxis, and then,
So
I know
whatever
you guys have stuff scheduled tomorrow, but my flight leaves at 12, so I won't be around.
That's because if you have like, I mean, 12, then you have to.
Sustainable, positive.
It's okay. No
We're
problem.
studying at 9, so
Yeah.
you guys join us.
No, I think I still.
12 o'clock for your flight, it will be too much of, yeah, risk, too much of a risk, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. No problem. Thanks for joining us. Thanks a lot. Tomorrow. So you have extended.
Yeah, because Sydney has to do that couple of years. She's going to do it after like 2 or so things.
I mean, if you like it,
Because I asked
and thank you so much.
Thank you so
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll leave a couple.
Sure, yeah, thank you so much.
Appreciate it, thank you. Yeah, I know, like, because I asked to extend like the schedule, right? That's great. And then if we are going
You're joined by.
not for tomorrow. Not for tomorrow. We have to also because they have
Like afternoon flight.
That's how they always try and do with So.
If it's 4:10, you could.
Yeah.
You gotta be practical, you gotta be pragmatic. Well, of course you gotta be
Depending on the
realistic.
Sydney strikes.
So, we look for free.
Probably that location that
All the places.
No, but we never found a colonizer.
So.
yeah, she has like 2 participants. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
American Congo.
Only 2.
It came out of Cambridge.
We keep like at least 20 minutes for each.
Magistrate, Blackstone, and the whole. So it inevitably means, so we're having imposed on us.
She said like still she has to do 2.
Christian, European perspective. And with the arrogance that goes with it, because that's the only thing they know. And if you're mixed church and state, it's also supported by God. So it's a real problem. So.
Oh, okay.
I wrote
This one?
for a publication called.
It actually matched the cover, so.
It is my
Okay, so.
We're graduating tribal courts, we're graduating. Canada, I mean, so.
Just request to settle down.
Hello everyone, we are going to start our next panel, so I would kindly ask you to take your seats.
I really want
Once more. Once more.
Can you tap the microphone? Hello everyone. Can I have your attention please? We are going to start our next session.
Sooner we start, you can go home sooner.
Yeah, that's our final presentation. So final panel of the day focuses on climate change in the Arctic. Joining us are Dr. Fabrice Calmel, Dr. Alice Crawford, Dr. Imdad Haig. Dr. Fabrice Calmels is the research chair in the Permafrost and Geoscience at the UConn Research Center, where he leads an applied research program focused on permafrost thaw, geoscience, northern infrastructure, and climate change adaptation. His work examines how thawing permafrost affects northern landscape communities, traditional lands, highways, and other linear infrastructure across Yukon and northern Canada. He completed his PhD at Laval University, where he studied permafrost in Nunavut and helped pioneer the use of CT scan methods in permafrost research. Since moving to Whitehorse in 2014, he has developed the Permafrost and Geoscience Research Group, working with communities, governments, industry and academic partners to assess and mitigate permafrost-related risks. His expertise includes geomorphological mapping, permafrost coring, geotechnical analysis, cryostratigraphy, environmental monitoring, electrical resistivity tomography, ground penetrating, radar, UAV imagery, and photogrammetry. His research is especially relevant to northern resilience, climate adaptation, infrastructure safety, and evidence-based decision-making in Canada's north. Dr. Alex Crawford is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental and Geography at the University of Manitoba, where he specializes in Arctic climate systems and the dynamics of extratropical cyclones. His research focuses on the complex interactions between Arctic storms, sea ice, and the ocean surface, and how these relationships are being transformed by global warming. He has developed widely used storm detection and tracking methods and has published extensively on topics ranging from Arctic cyclone intensification to the lengthening of open water periods in the Arctic. His work is frequently featured in national media outlets, including CBC Manitoba, where he provides expert commentary on local impacts of broader Arctic climate change. Dr. Imdad Haig is a professor in the Natural Resource Institute with the Clayton H. Riddle Faculty of Environment, Earth and Resource at the University of Manitoba, where he specializes in resource and environmental management. His research focuses on natural hazards and disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, community resilience, and the integration of indigenous and local knowledge into environmental policy. A prolific author, he has published over 200 articles and 9 books, including Hazards in a Fickle Environment, Bangladesh, Disaster Risk and Vulnerability, and serves as Chief Technical Advisor at Bangbandhu Center of Bangladesh Studies in Canada. He is the founder president of the Canadian Risk of Hazards Network and was a member of the Canadian National Delegation at the 2005 UN Hugo World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. Please welcome Dr. Fabrice, Dr. Alex Crawford, and Dr. Imdad Haig. Sir.
Dr. Fabrice, go ahead.
Dr. Fabrice, the floor is yours.
Yes. Okay. I was expecting to have some question, but yeah, okay. Yes, so I guess some of the question I was asked to answer was about what was the challenge that was caused by permafrost. It is my specialty on community and the people living in the north. And I think that there is four main things that are really impacting, considering that permafrost is the foundation of the northern society in Canada. You know, about 50% of land surface is underlain by permafrost. So the first thing is that the community themselves are impacted in the sense that all the infrastructures can be at risk, depending on what type of ground they are sitting in. Some buildings, some roads, airports already are distressed by the presence of permafrost. And it's hard for sometimes for the community to keep up with this impact. Also, even the new construction, the new projects have to take into account the presence of permafrost and how it will behave. Which means that they have to think now more about new foundation design, but also a better idea about the site selection, and also how they can afford these kind of things to expand their community in this permafrost environment. Of course, it impacts housing crisis, because before that, you had to design an infrastructure to be in equilibrium with the permafrost. But now this cursor is changing, right? What was good in the past may not be as good now because the climate is changing and the permafrost is warming, and so there is degradation that was not anticipated. And now you have to take in consideration this moving target to develop your community. When we think about livelihoods, they are not just activities, right? They are really supporting the community, and they also taking place on this specific terrain and the ecosystem that comes with permafrost. Often, plants, animals have activities linked to the presence of permafrost. Okay, that's a ground condition that dictates the type of ecosystem that you have. And when permafrost thaws, everything changes. The drainage can shift, the vegetation can transform. Sometimes you have slow movement, thermokarst. So it's a lot of change in surface condition that has an impact on everything. The ecosystem is not static anymore. So the nature of the trees are changing. If the trees or the presence of lichen moss is changing, also is the fauna, so the game that comes and you can hunt and live from, which connects me to also food security. There is two kind of food security, two kind of food: the country food and the imported food. For the imported food, often if you are in the Arctic and if you don't have, you rely on airports to import your food and your goods. And if these airports of landing strip are failing, then you may lose access to goods. That's a reality. Sometimes also you rely on roads, but the roads can be closed because there have been landslides and slumps occurring, and it takes time to rebuild. It has already happened along the Dempster Road. Right, and no goods pass, no fuel, nothing. So that's a serious issue. The other one is the country food. As I said, a lot of people rely on country food. The game, the harvesting, fishing, and these now are impacted. The ecosystem is not static anymore. In some place, you may just have a change of landscapes that may impact the presence of caribou, like in Northwest Territory. In some other place, that's a lake where you used to fish or to go during the summer, and it rains, and there is no lakes anymore. These are things that change and does not come back. So the impact can be very deep on the community on this level. And finally, there is also the cultural continuity, which means that the identity of your community, the identity of the people living there is deeply linked to the landscape. Okay? If your landscape changes, your use of the landscape is changing, and it has an impact on the knowledge and the practices attached to this landscape. For example, some medicinal plants can be linked to specific environment, and this is environment evolving. If you have like a nice bushy area and small trees, then it may become wetter. The trees and the moss disappear, the lichen disappear, the small berries, the plants disappear, and you are left with a swamp. This is already occurring. Also, there is cultural sites that are very important, like old settlement, burial ground, ancestral sites eroding and collapsing. Herschel Island is a good example. So yeah, and again, it's a loss for the community, you know. So land is not so much a backdrop, that it is a medium for the culture to be passed on. And that's it for my first.
Thank you. Microphone.
Thank you. I would like to invite Dr. Crawford.
All right, and I have some slides set up here, so let me just make sure I'm sharing everything right. So that'll be right there. And then we'll jump over to that. And can I just get confirmation that that's showing up correctly?
Yes, we see it.
Great, thank you. All right, thank you for having me here. I wish I could be there in person. I have some other commitments in Winnipeg today. So my expertise is in a few different things in the Arctic climate system, sea ice, and storm systems. So I'm going to take a look at two of those. And before I dig into that, just throwing up the University of Manitoba's territorial acknowledgement here for a second. These are the official words that the University of Manitoba uses, but I also like to say for a talk like this, you're going to see in my slides, it's definitely a Western science lens. That's how I position myself. However, quite a few of the things that you're going to see today are informed by, often as co-authors, local community members in Churchill, in Clyde River, in Nunavut, and several other places. So without that two-eyed seeing is a phrase we often use there, what I'm showing today really wouldn't be possible. Okay, so with all of that, some good motivation, I think, is always this idea that the Arctic is changing faster than the rest of the world in response to climate change. It is warming faster than the rest of the world. It's over 3 times faster, maybe up to 4 times, depending on how you measure things. And one way I just like to demonstrate this is here's a map that's showing you the difference in the average annual temperature from 1991 to 2020, so our most recent full 3 decades, compared to 1951 to 1980. And if you look at a place like the Western Pacific Ocean, it's warmed up a little bit, 0.2 to 0.6 degrees of warming. So that's one of the places that's changed relatively slowly. And then you go to places in the Arctic Ocean and you see that some of them have changed, increasing by about 2 degrees, and there's some places that have increased by about 5. So that is a much, much stronger change. Okay, and so that leads us to the first of the 2 things I want to touch on, which is sea ice decline. It's well known in a lot of circles at this point that yes, there is less sea ice in the Arctic than there used to be. When I talk about this, I often like to flip that definition though, and rather than ask how much sea ice is there, ask how long is any particular area ice-free in the middle of summer. And then the map that you're seeing over there on the left is showing you a darker red for a stronger increase in that seasonal ice-free period. And if you look at a place like Baffin Bay, which has that lightest pink color, that represents a change of about 1 to 2 days per year. However, note that the record that I'm looking at here, which is coming from satellites, goes back to 1979, which means we have more than 40 years of data here, which means that, yeah, Baffin Bay is ice-free for over a month longer than it used to be. Actually, getting close to a month and a half at this point. And if you go to a place like Hudson Bay, which is one of the slowest areas of change that you see on this map, we're hovering somewhere between about 0.5 and 1 day per year for most of Hudson Bay. Well, over 40 years, that actually is still almost a month that it's changed on average. And if you go to the Barents Sea, over here north of Scandinavia, that's the area of fastest change. And that darkest red color there is over 6 days per year. And yes, that does mean, if you do the math, there are 8 months longer ice-free right now than there were in the 1980s. That is not entirely climate change, to be clear, but the global warming of climate change is a very large part of that positive trend. All right, so if we look into the future, like how much or more change do we expect? One number that I think is really helpful is that on average throughout the Arctic, for every degree of global warming we have, there's roughly 1 month longer for the ice-free period. Now that does vary a good bit regionally. If you go to a place like the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the change is very slow. Compared to that, it's only about a week per degree of warming, but that's because the Gulf of St. Lawrence already has very little sea ice. And if you go up to like the Central Arctic Ocean, or CAO on that map, that's changing really fast at about 45 days per degree of warming. But places like Hudson Bay, Baffin Bay are near the average. And again, 1 month per degree of global warming is a fairly easy thing to remember. So if we keep that in mind, and we then think about, well, how much warming could we have, we can start to ask, how much warming would we need before that ice-free period would exceed a certain number of days? And so I've shown you here is 90 days or about 3 months on the left, 180 days or about 6 months in the middle, and 270 days or about 9 months on the right. And one thing that I think this is helpful for showing us is the limits of what we expect from global warming. If you look in, for example, just in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, up around the North Pole, the color there for 90 days, that reddish color, is telling us that we would need somewhere between 3 and 3.5 degrees of warming in order for the center of the Arctic Ocean to average 3 months ice-free in a year. That's a good bit of warming. That is totally feasible within the 21st century, but it is a good bit of warming. And it also tells us that in order to get that to 180 days, or like 6 months out of the year ice-free, we would need to get up to 4.5 to 5 degrees of warming. And honestly, that's not very likely by the end of the 21st century. We have done enough to mitigate climate change at this point. That is unlikely to happen. And getting to 270 days ice-free, that's not going to happen in the 21st century. I can be fairly confident without some major change to the way the world works. So in other words, there still will be winter sea ice. There still will be sea ice in the Central Arctic Ocean, even in a really strong warming scenario. And even places like Hudson Bay, you can see, will still have sea ice in the winter, even with a strong warming scenario. But zooming in a little bit more on Hudson Bay, which is a place that I study a little bit more closely, it is true that if we have these longer ice-free periods, that places like Hudson Bay are becoming and will continue to become more navigable. So one thing that people are interested in, of course, is this idea of shipping from the Port of Churchill out to the Labrador Sea and then to Europe, to Africa, to South America, etc. And if you look at this graph, that's looking at that whole route and whether there's like a full connected path that is actually navigable for vessels. And this is vessels that aren't ice strengthened, to be clear on this graph. And the green line swiggling there, that's showing you observations. And then the red and the brownish gray are showing you two different ways of looking into the future that agree pretty well with each other. And in both cases, you can see that steady increase up to about 3.5 degrees of warming. And then if we were to go beyond that, the trend actually accelerates and starts getting even stronger. So yes, the Arctic Ocean is definitely becoming more navigable. But at the same time, I think one notable consequence of this is that the sea ice is becoming less navigable. And that means it's less present for use by things like ring seals that I'm showing you on the left, or as a route for navigation for the communities who live up in the Arctic. And one of the impacts that in Western Hudson Bay is of particular interest in thinking around Churchill is, of course, polar bears and how this links to the ecosystem more broadly or to tourism more specifically. And yeah, it is true. We can look historically and we know that the more time that polar bears are forced to spend on land, the lower the survival rates are, and specifically, or more so for the youngest bears and the oldest bears than say the fully fledged adults. And so these are just two different graphs that are showing you on the top the survival rate for younger bears, so this is juvenile, 0 to 1 years old, and then on the bottom it's showing you a graph of the date of breakup of the sea ice in Western Hudson Bay, and those years when there's early sea ice breakup, yes, there is a lower survival rate. And so this does tell us that there is this physical functional relationship, and then we can start extrapolating that out and see, okay, based on those sea ice changes that I was showing you, what can we expect for this polar bear population? And if we look at what things are like historically, at about 1 degree of warming above the pre-industrial level, which is what we were experiencing in like the 2000s, early 2010s, then you had about 139 days that were ice-free, and that is totally doable for the polar bears in Western Hudson Bay. They can handle that. And then going forward in time and looking at the climate models, and these have been bias adjusted, by the way, to make sure they match observations well. Once you get to 2 degrees of warming, you're at about 163 days ice-free. So yeah, that means the polar bears have to spend more time on land. That means, yes, there is more stress for them. It is harder for them to keep going and to recruit new polar bears. In other words, continue to grow the population or sustain the population. You get to 3 degrees of warming, by then you're up to 189 days ice-free. And the historical data suggests that by the time you're at 3 degrees of warming, you've surpassed the limit of what is sustainable for adult male polar bears, which is somewhere around about 165 days. So yes, there is the possibility you lose the polar bears in Western Hudson Bay. One thing that I think is very clear, I should make very clear though, is this is not saying polar bears are extinct on the Earth. This is saying they can't live in Hudson Bay anymore. The data suggests they will not go extinct even with 3.5, 4 degrees of warming, because there will still be places they can live farther. All right, so that's one thing that changes is the sea ice, and then the other thing, and these two are linked to some degree, is extreme weather. Now, as you take away the sea ice in Hudson Bay and Baffin Bay, the Arctic Ocean, you expose more water to the atmosphere. That actually does increase the amount of evaporation in the atmosphere. And that does mean that you can have more rain and more snow. And it's not just more rain, it's also more snow. It's not like we convert all the way to rain, but yes, actually you also convert some of your snow to rainfall. And this is true in winter, and this is true in summer. The two maps I'm showing you here, anywhere there's green, that's showing you an increase in the precipitation of the Arctic as the world warms. Anywhere that is brown, which you see in the mid-latitudes in summer some, that's a decrease in the precipitation from storms. In winter, it's almost ubiquitous through the mid-latitudes and the Arctic that you have an increase in precipitation. In summer, there's that stark contrast between latitudes. And all of this, where there's an increase, is largely coming not from there being more storms, but just the storms that you have are producing more millimeters of precipitation per hour. So there's just a more intense precipitation rate. And when you say it that way, yeah, that does mean that you can have extremes becoming more likely. So to zoom in on one example of what's happened recently in Clyde River or Kingakugapik in Baffin Island. So this community population about 1,200. I wouldn't be surprised if the most recent census makes that a little bit higher. It has a mixed economy. And in February of 2022, that picture there is what it looked like. There was a lot of snow going on. All right, so what was going on in this winter? Well, a lot of blizzards. So here's a weather station record. The red line is showing you the wind speed. The blue lines are those bars are showing you the snowfall that was occurring. And anywhere you see gray, that was a blizzard event. And the blizzard event here means that there were high winds and there was snow in the air. Oftentimes that's because there was snow falling. It could also mean that you were reactivating some of the snow that fell in a recent event. And in this particular winter, there were 33 days with high winds and snow either falling or blowing, and 25 of those had the visibility dip below 400 meters, which is the ultimate limit of, is this a blizzard? No one's gonna argue with you if the visibility is getting that low. And the peak of all this was in January. From the 18th to the 28th, there were 11 days in which 8 of those were blizzard days. That was a very, very rough situation for the community, but it wasn't just because there was an extreme weather event. It's not just because there was a lot of precipitation and in particular a lot of wind. There also were problems with snow removal. So this community had 2 loaders that were broken down, and they had been broken down since early November. And they also had a deficiency in the amount of diesel fuel they had. And so because of those 2 things, they were limited to operating a single snowplow, and that was limited to clearing the airstrip. That was the one thing that it was going to be handled. And so what that meant was they didn't have the ability to use their trucks as they normally would for water and sewage operations. And 60 home sewage tanks froze for the lack of running water. In addition to this, there were problems with resupply. Even with the ability to clear the runway, the fact that they were having so many blizzards meant that there were relatively few flights that were able to land, and they had to land only when there were gaps in the blizzard events. And so that means resources, including the diesel and imported food, were limited for the community. And this, now the community ended up digging out as much as they could. They relied on country food. They did everything they could to work with the bad situation they had. and they showed plenty of resilience and plenty of ability to be resourceful. But you look at a situation like this, and one thing I was asked to talk about a little bit were, are there any like government interventions that I, as a physical scientist, not a social scientist, might look at as being useful for a more secure Arctic in the face of climate change? And I think looking at this case study in particular is helpful for me to say that one thing that I think would be the #1 priority is prioritizing investment in people. And I put in parentheses there as opposed to investment in AI, because that is something that this particular government in Canada has been focusing more on. You could enhance the community capacity in a place like CRRIC just by making it so that they had better energy and water storage available, more spare parts available, better training to maintain and fix heavy equipment. These are small, you don't need AI for this, you just need practical sense to do this. Also supporting more land-based activities, so more local food sources, country food sources, would make the community more resilient to this sort of event. And facilitating self-determination for communities about how they might want to change things, how they might want to devise plans. So these are all things that don't require new technology, they don't require innovation, they just require common sense and actually listening to local communities. And then when you have a situation where, yes, this was the worst blizzard winter ever recorded in Clyde River, by the way, 2 of the last 3 winters have also been in the top 5. So this is a concern that is only going to continue. Another thing that, like thinking about what Ottawa can do for this sort of situation, is better maintaining the observational weather network. This is something that I think is not getting nearly enough attention. There's plenty of attention on trying to make better weather forecasts with AI, but guess what? If you don't have a good observational network, there's no way of validating or training your AI to make sure it's doing a good job. And if you look at the United States, even Alaska, which is Arctic compared to Arctic Canada, the weather network in Arctic Canada is not as good as the network in Alaska. And it's not just spatial. Here is just another community on Baffin Island that I work with in Pangerton. This is a record of just the days where there is available precipitation data from the weather station at the airport there, or weather stations, because there's actually more than one that operates. And I think what's really, really notable here is that in an 11-year period, from 1997 to 2007, they had nearly perfect coverage of precipitation data at the airport. And then something happened. Something happened in 2008 to make it so it is no longer consistent that they have good data. And that difference is a heavier reliance on automated weather observing systems in 2008. So they got new technology, supposedly better technology. It is better in some ways, absolutely, but it also is less resilient. So there are reasons to keep with older technology that, by the way, also worked in the 1930s, and just maintaining it. That is something that could be done that would be very useful. And then finally, just an overall statement would be mitigating global warming by curbing emissions. The more that we mitigate the amount of warming that's going to happen, the less change there will be, and the fewer concerns there will be about that change, the fewer impacts there will be. There are tipping points in the climate system that are dangerous, that are concerning, absolutely, but there are also a lot of things in the climate system that are totally reversible. If you were to cut back our emissions to the point where we're at net zero, and then you were able to get below net zero and actually start taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, something like Arctic sea ice, it would be back to where it was within a few decades. It would not take that long. So that means that curbing emissions is a very worthwhile endeavor. And one point of optimism is that right now, we're on pace for somewhere in the medium emission scenario that was designed. We are not on the high emission scenario. And the fact that I'm able to say that confidently is a good sign that humans can do this, and that if we keep pushing governments, then yeah, they can get us on the low end of medium, even if the low emission scenario is getting close to out of reach. And that is where I'd like to end things, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford. I would like to invite Dr. Hay.
Thank you, Alex. Everybody must be exhausted by now, and you must be saturated. So I don't want to take too long time. I want to make some key points by recapping a few of the point that I had made in our Winnipeg workshop. So let me start with that on net zero emission. Although we are in medium emission phase that Alex elaborated, but net zero is just an imagination in Ethiopia. Right now, we are losing the ground, and I don't think that we can cap it 1.5 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial level. We are already losing that. And the Arctic, particularly, you heard from morning till now that they are facing warming 3 times, 4 times than the other parts of the world. So, can you have the next slide, please? So, you see that with that kind of pace, the most vulnerable region, not only in Canada, but also in the entire world, is the northern region. And the Arctic states and provinces of Canada obviously is most vulnerable. This morning you heard that Arctic, we overgeneralize. We just, make it oversimplification. It's pretty diverse. Even if you look at, the Inuit territories, I mean, there are 4 regions in Canada, linguistically speaking, with different dialects and so on. In the west part, where the, Yukon and so on, and then you can see that Nunavut and the Nunavik and Nunavut in the Labrador region. So it's pretty diverse, and also in terms of exposure and vulnerability, and the tree line is also pretty diverse. Can I go to the next slide, please? So is this the tree line? And next slide, please. And in terms of population, you heard that in 2021, there were only 70,000 people. Right now, it will be about 100,000, Today, this morning, you saw that there were 100,000 people. So in terms of total population number, it's not a huge number, but these populations are most critical. And in Canada, which is quite different than Norway, it's other way around, that 85% of the people, on average, they are indigenous people. What in Norway is the other way around. And that has tremendous implications for all kinds of dialogues and development planning and so on. Can I have the next slide, please? So in terms of adaptation to climate change, when we are losing on the mitigation side, the only option we have is to adapt. So what is adaptation? Adaptation is basically to take the deliberate action to reduce the impact, either by a different level, different scale, either individual level or by institutions, government, NGOs at all levels. So there are 2 major systematic reviews done in Canada by James Ford, who was in McGill and then now moved to UK in the Leeds University, but he extensively, his team over the last 15 years time, reviewed what kind of adaptation took place in the Arctic. And his conclusion is that not much adaptation took place at the higher governmental level. Most of the things happen at the individual level or at the local community level. There are some governmental initiatives that will come in a minute, but most of these things happen at the community and individual level. Basically, the adaptation took place at the individual level by the hunters and gatherers. They have to now travel a long distance, and also their knowledge and India's knowledge they rely more on elderly. Next slide, please. So they are addressing basically food insecurity problem. You can see that the caribous, their numbers are going down and they're not available in the traditional conventional area. So they have to go far away, and they are making adaptation in terms of knowledge. They're basically discussing from the elderly and local community and so on. So those kind of adaptation took place. Can I have the next, please? There are some, in terms of climate and non-climate stresses, I don't want to take too much time on this, but it's not the environmental changes and climate change that is taking place, but also food insecurity and other kind of personal and community vulnerability that are happening simultaneously. For example, infrastructure, housing, all these things are happening at the same time. So the Arctic community, the indigenous communities are becoming more and more vulnerable. On the other hand, we heard that economic opportunity, navigational opportunity, all the multinational corporations, and the Monroe Doctrine has an eye to have all the critical minerals and so on. So all these things are happening at the same time. Whereas indigenous communities are being marginalized, they are becoming more vulnerable. On the other hand, corporations are seeing a big opportunity. And it's from Russia to China, you heard this morning, from everyone. So when these things, it's a theater house. When all these things are happening, the option is to adapt. So who is doing this adaptation? How to get there? Can I have the next, please? So a lot of things are happening, like co-management in terms of natural resources, fisheries, and other, forestry, wildlife happening, So indigenous associations or local level organizations, they are partnering with different government departments and so on. In many cases, they succeeded. In other cases, they did not. But what happened that from lessons learned, they established a network. And that capital is now helping to build the relationships. Can I go to the next slide, please? I want to go back to Ken Court's elaborate discussion on what he hammered again and again, that Canadian government and institutions make big promises, but very little kept in the long run. There are many reasons. There are a lot of excuses as well, but those barriers could not have addressed effectively. So the only way we can see that, this morning we heard from even David, he was saying that why Canada cannot take a lead to create a model of indigenous empowerment. New Zealand has done with the Maoris in comparison to any other, global players. Why Canada can't lead? This is an opportunity for us to talk about indigenous-led sovereignty. Now, to wrap up these things, what I think Canada needs to rethink and reevaluate itself is to have a new kind of relationship with the Arctic provinces. Because these are Arctic, like Quebec province, they're asking for distinct recognition, distinct culture, distinct language, and so on. The Arctic provinces also must, from their indigenous perspective, should ask for distinct status and a new relationship with the federal government. Canadian Federation should redefine itself if indigenous-led sovereignty is meant to be implemented effectively. And only that way, the human security, Arctic security, and Canadian national security can be guaranteed in the long term. Without the sustainability of the Arctic community, Arctic territory, and without empowerment, effective empowerment of the Arctic institutions and people, I'm talking about indigenous people, where 85% are indigenous, Canada will remain in the model of colonialism. All the multinational investment, billions of dollars right now being invested, it will follow the same colonial model. Like it's an integration for the interest of the corporate benefits and benefits of the Southerners. Northerners will benefit only they're empowered, they have the political, social, economic power. And that could only be done through constitutional redefinition and newer way of establishing the relationships. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Howe. Any questions?
Everybody might be exhausted, so I think we had enough. So we can continue on that. Yes, please.
By question or definition, do you mean opening the Constitution and changing the Constitution according to the amended formula of consensus?
Yes. Consensus is
so how?
Is the way.
How to do this?
Yes, again, in Canada, for example, Quebec still has not signed the 1982, Constitution, right? So it's a longer term process, but it's through dialogue and negotiation and give and take. So everybody has to give up, and come up with common ground. But if we want to keep the federation intact.
But everybody has a veto right. Every province has a veto right.
Yes.
They tried this in the 1980s and 90s. It didn't work and led to the near separation of the country.
Yes.
How are we sure this is not going to lead to such an outcome?
Well, it depends on the consensus. It's not guaranteed, right? So obviously it's an open-ended question, but right now you see that there are threats coming from the south, for example, so we remain that kind of vulnerable. So Canadians has to come together and realize that the world is changing, not within Canada, but also outside Canada. So that's why national interest and national federation in 21st and beyond will remain a question, and Canadians altogether will have to decide how they want to proceed for the next generations.
Any questions for the scientists?
Any questions for the scientists?
No, science is tired. Okay. So, okay, thank you very much for Dr. Alex Crawford and
Thank you very much
Fabrice
for
Camus.
Dr. Fabrice, Dr. Alex Crawford, and Dr. Ho.
Thank you very much.
Now we are moving to our closing remarks. I would like to thank for joining us today. As you all know, we have a second session tomorrow. The location is at 4 Queen Elizabeth Driveway, Ottawa, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. As we approach the conclusion, I invite Dr. Kausa Ahmed to offer closing reflections and remarks. Thank you.
I don't mean to bore you, and I know you are exhausted, and thank you for weathering this brutal campaign of knowledge sharing. We would like to thank you not only for being present, but also share and listen all the diverse ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a project. Don't expect too much from us. It's a tiny project, but I think it's an important one. This is the foundation of the discussions you have had today, and how indigenous component can be built in and be kept in the forefront in devising policies in the north. So that is the whole idea and endeavor. So far we have done two of the kind of very interesting model of discussion. We call it PARIS, Paris, not the France's Paris, Winnipeg's Paris. So this Paris means initial discussion, central presentation, then sub-thematic discussions, and followed by deep policy discussion on the second day. So tomorrow, what we are going to do is we are going to synthesize all that we have discussed tonight, and Dr. Sabrina is our main lead here, and tomorrow we'll gather again in a different place, because War Museum is very expensive, and that is why possibly War Museum, not Peace Museum, I don't know. Maybe we have to open up the Constitution here too. Having said so, tomorrow we'll have those very intense discussion, and finally we'll bring out our policy paper. And of course, this project ends with these two interesting discussions. I'd like to also end by saying and expressing my deep gratitude to our keynote speaker, Dr. Mary, and he is really such a gentleman. He never complained that, look, I'm busy, I have one thing to publish. He straight away said, oh, no worries, I'm coming. And he not only came by himself, he brought his students. So thank you so much, Dr. Landrut, very much from the Institute. And all of our presenters are volunteer. They will not be given any honorarium, just so that you know. On record, funders have some moratorium on so they're all volunteers. So they spoke, they came, and so at this stage, I would like to also express our deep gratitude to all the presenters, including those who came from outside. And finally, I would say, before I end, is the group of volunteers for who I think this whole system went, I would say, relatively flawless, because you never trust like your partner, the IT. So it will betray you at some point in your life. So today I would like to start by thanking Dr. Sabrina. Sabrina, raise your hand, please. She's our senior research associate. Then we have Sydney Reed. She's our intern from University of Manitoba, Masters in Human Rights. Our MC and very important person today, Mother Radias. She's also a research associate. And finally, last but not the least, my eldest son, Yamura Ahmed Orko. He is also a proud corporal in the Canadian Armed Forces. So he has done most of the logistics today. And although I said, but I forgot two very important three persons here today. David Gerald Newman, our founder advisor, and our advisor, Darcia Senf and Gary Senf, those who all flew from Winnipeg just to support us in this very event. Thank you, Darcia. Thank you, Gary. So, our China expert is also with us still. So if you have any questions, you can shoot. Otherwise, Eric, are you available tomorrow or no? No. Okay, thank you. No, absolutely. And we have discussed a couple of things. And since Eric is here, let me tell you, from our institute, we are working on a very interesting project. I would request you to tune in. I already shared with Eric when he was in Winnipeg last week, Tuesday. So we are working on a book project, Foreign Interference and Transnational Repression. So it will be hopefully coming out from Routledge, in the month of October, November from Routledge, UK. We're just finishing our manuscript. So if you are interested, have a look and support us, www.cric.org, and have a nice rest of the evening. Bye-bye.